I have a very interesting topic for you today. We are talking about the sexual revolution, and this is a topic I have not had on my podcast before. So I brought in an expert for you, and Terrell Clemmons is on the show today. She's been on the show before, and she is from Salvo Magazine. And I get this magazine hard copy mailed to me, which I love hard copy things. I know we live in the digital age, but I'm sorry, I need to hold it in my hand and interact with it, circle things and highlight, underline. And everyone from Salvo is just stellar writers, top notch. So we'll tell you how you can get linked up with Salvo and Terrell at the end of this. But I want to let you know a little bit more about her. So before we have her come on, Terrell Clemmons has a bachelor's in science in computer science from Clemson University and worked in software development until she hopped off the career track to be a full-time mom. Raised in a church-going home, she lived complacently toward the faith until she became a parent. Newly motivated at that point to find truth about the bigger issues of life, she researched the worldview claims of Christianity and became convinced that they were actually true. She began writing on Christian living and apologetics in 2004 and joined Salvo in 2007. She has also worked with Ratio Christi and Anchors Away Apologetics Ministries for Youth. With her kids now grown and her husband deceased, she lives in Indiana with her dog, the only family member still at home, where she serves as deputy editor of Salvo Magazine. Terrell, I love that. I don't know that I knew that about you, with having to go back and reevaluate some of the things that you believed. Interesting.
Uh, yeah. And one of the things I like about you is you really drill down on apologetics and how we really need to be convinced that the claims of Christianity are true if we're going to live accordingly in a culture that's really hostile to the Christian faith or is getting increasingly hostile to it. So yeah, that's really how my faith was solidified. I grew up, as I think I've mentioned before, in the Bible Belt, where kind of everybody went to church. So I never really gave it that much thought until later in life, and especially when I started having kids and raising kids, and it just makes you think more deeply. And so I went back and did some research and really became convinced that it's true. It gives us the true picture of reality, the
Mhm.
best explanation of reality.
I love that. I think if there's something that is going to drive you to make sure that you're instilling values and beliefs into the next generation, especially as a parent, it's going to be seeing your little kids and looking into their eyes. And when they start asking you, why do we go to church? Why do we believe in the Bible? That alone will really shake you to think, I don't know that I know the answer to that question. And hopefully, good, responsible parents such as yourself will look into it more, which just increases your own faith, and helps give your kids the truth. So that's
Right.
awesome. I love that. Well, today we're talking about the sexual revolution. And I I always, and I think my audience knows this, I always kind of compose some questions as a guideline for us. Like, what do I want to ask my guest? Where do I want to take this conversation? Honestly, this was hard because I thought, I want to know, I want to ask all the things about the sexual revolution and seeing all of these ties and stuff. And I just thought, you know what, let's go with the ones that I was able to compose. And then if we have to have you back on again in the future to answer some of the questions that I don't get to, then we'll go from there. But this is just a interesting topic to me. And I think it's because I came out of the purity culture during the, what was it? The 90s is when I was a teenager. So I feel like it was like, purity rings, and we would be separated at camp, boys and girls. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think you have to approach it correctly, but I don't think there was anything wrong with wanting to make sure that our teachers instilled those values into us. But we're going to touch on all of this, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I like to ask the basic questions first so we can lay that foundation. Many people have no doubt heard of the sexual revolution. I don't doubt that for a second. We've all had history and things, but to make sure that we're all on the same page, will you tell us what the sexual revolution is and like the time frame in history that it came about?
Yeah, that's a good opening question. And just in broad terms, and let me back up a little bit. I wouldn't call myself an expert. There are scholars who have really spent more time, really studying the history of the ideas. But in general terms, as I have seen it, or not as I've seen it, but as I understand it, is if in Western civilization is based on Christianity, and the Bible is our foundational text, right? And the Bible gives us a model for marriage and tells us that sex is really something that is to be contained within marriage. And I think of the sexual revolution, the seeds for it being laid really in Europe in probably about the 1800s. And this comes after the Reformation, after what we call the Enlightenment. But both of that, well, the Reformation was really after Martin Luther questioned the church. And then following that, secularists decided to question the church as well. And they wanted to throw out the presuppositions or the assumptions of the Christian worldview that there was a God and who had revealed himself in human history. And at the same time, or concurrent with that, started throwing off these rules about sex. And it started from there. There was a psychiatrist, I think he was a psychiatrist. His name was Magnus Hirschfeld in late 1800s Germany. This was the same era when Freud was making everything about sex and saying that if sexual desires are repressed, that creates like neurotic problems. Whereas the biblical idea tells us, well, we kind of do need to channel our sexual desires and we need to channel them towards marriage. Freud threw all that out. At the same time, there was Karl Marx, who was his new theory about economics and people groups fighting against one another for power. And this guy, Magnus Hirschfeld, he was a homosexual. And that's where the term homosexual came from. I think he coined that term. Before that era, I mean, for lack of a better word, men who had sex with men were generally called sodomites. That came straight out of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And he coined a new term. He wanted to study it. He wanted to make it like an academic discipline. And he was pretty successful in that. And that's, okay, we're talking late 1800s. And then early 1900s, and then World War I and World War II broke out in Europe. A lot of these intellectuals came across the Atlantic to America and went into academia. And those ideas found really pretty fertile soil in America, where we think about rugged individualism and people doing their own thing. And maybe we have a little bit of a rebellious spirit in us. And rebellion may not be wrong. There are some things that maybe it's a good idea to rebel against. But that idea of rebellion against these ideas of sex being contained and channeled into marriage gradually were just challenged and then thrown out. And then you get to, we kind of maybe in America think of the 60s as a real turning point. And it kind of was. And it was for things like the sexual revolution. There was the pill, the hormonal contraceptive pill was, I believe, approved for general use in 1960, but it was in the early 1960s. And it just kind of took off like wildfire. You also had Cosmopolitan Magazine, Ms. Magazine, some of those things came along and they glamorized this um, life of the sexually free woman who was no longer constrained to be at home raising babies. Not necessarily that the biblical worldview says women have to stay home and only raise babies. That's not what the biblical worldview says. But the rebellious spirit took root, pushed back against the idea that sex is really to be for marriage. And it took off from there. And so even that was like, what, this is 50, 60 years ago now. And it's gone to seed. And we find ourselves in a situation where it seems like everything is about sex now, and
Mm-hmm.
sex has become highly politicized. And there are those who are now dividing people into people groups based on how they identify themselves sexually.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a revolution just means something has been turned over or turned around. And ultimately, it just means that idea that sex is sex works best in marriage. I'm trying not to put it in thou shalt rules, but just in general principles. It works better for everybody if it's contained within marriage, because if it's contained within marriage, children have their parents, they're more likely to have stable homes.
Mhm.
And when women give themselves to a man sexually, they're more likely to know that that man's going to be there if they get pregnant,
Mhm.
and that they're not going to be told to go get an abortion or something like that. It works better for men. It works better for women. It works better for children. It works better for families, and that means it works better for the whole society.
Yeah. I have so many thoughts rolling around in my head about that. And I think, when you said I don't want to put it into these thou shalt rules, do's and don'ts, I was actually thinking about that earlier today, like, because I'm thinking about scripting a podcast on legalism, an episode. And it's like, is Christianity really this do's and don'ts? But I think of it more as in the way that God has designed life to be lived. And we have boundaries for everything, even food. The Bible tells us in Proverbs that gluttony is eating too much, that drinking too much alcohol is drunkardness. And then you lost this awareness of, keeping your wits about you when you're drunk. So there's boundaries within that. And I look at it as boundaries. Sex has boundaries because it works properly within the function of marriage. Because, like you said, a woman getting pregnant or, outside of marriage doesn't have the protection of a loving husband who has is in this committed relationship. And so when you, like you said, to revolutionize something means to completely change it. And I think of those pictures of Woodstock and, the 60s of these hippies and wanting to this, a free spirit and all of that, how all of this has come about. But really, it's a mentality, like a thought process. And you kind of showed us that thought process starting like with Freud. I remember learning about Freud when I was taking a child psychology class in college, thinking, what is the weirdest. I thought it was just the weirdest mumbo jumbo, like he was talking about, I believe he even talked about more like the Oedipus complex when a son is in love with his mother. And I'm just like, what? You have to have some sort of wackadoo stuff going on in that mind to come up with this. But yes, I remember learning about Freud. So many say, oh, this started to take place in the 60s, but really, there was a moral shift that continued to happen much, much, further back in history that made this take place. Um,
And yeah, and that's right, a moral shift. And I think the moral shift is not just a decline where the populace by and large had a moral shift, but activists really do provoke the moral shift. Activists um, trying to push their ideas. And I told you about Magnus Hirschfeld, who was the psychiatrist, pushing their ideas under the guise of science and under the guise of being intellectually more advanced and more progressive. And yeah, it is often in many ways driven by activists. And unless people stick by their moral convictions and have good reasons to stick by their moral convictions, generally the activists do move the needle of the broad cultural opinion about things like that.
yes, I was actually listening because now we have, in our time, like you said, we have everything is sexualized. Your identity is attached to you know, your biological sex, heterosexual, homosexual, transsexual. I mean, all of these groups, these people groups that you're
Right.
put into these categories based upon how you identify
Mhm.
and who you basically have sex with, if you just want to get down to that nitty gritty. But
Pretty
even
much.
with pornography, it's like pornography at the fingertips of. I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were giving some stats of just like Pornhub, has over 100 and something million new users on a daily basis that come and visit. And some of these kids are as young as 9 years old being introduced to pornography, and some of it, a lot of it accidentally, but they're innocent little eyes. And this would not have happened before the sexual revolution. I mean, obviously that has a lot to do with technology and the advancement of the iPhone and things like that in the early 2000s. I think it was 2007 when the iPhone came on the scene, something like that. But it's like, but the sexual revolution has something to do with that. It's a domino effect. It's this progression from that time until now. And, you know, it's astounding when you see the repercussions of these bad ideas, the fighting for these things. And we have this individual expression, you know, individual expressionism today, where everybody wants to express themselves in a certain way so that way they can be seen and, you know, identified. And a lot of that has to do with the sexual revolution. But what are other repercussions of the sexual revolution, and what part, if any, does feminism play in it?
Other, you said repercussions,
Yeah, like what
repercussions or
repercussions?
ramifications.
Yeah, ramifications.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know who's done some really good research on this is Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse, and she has her own nonprofit ministry called the Ruth Institute,
Mm-hmm.
and she's Catholic, and she wrote a really fascinating book that summarized some movements really that can be traced back to the sexual revolution as their starting point. And one is divorce. I mean, before no fault divorce in America, a divorce was a whole lot harder to get. Now, women could get a divorce if they were being abused, or either partner could get a divorce based on abuse or infidelity, but they did have to prove that there was some sort of fault on the other part of the marriage partner. And no fault divorce basically did away with that and allowed one party to get a divorce for any reason. So a ramification of that is so many broken homes and children growing up in broken homes. And there have been a lot of studies done on people who got divorced and then 5 or 6 or 7 years later said, you know, we might have been, or those who stuck it out were grateful that they stuck it out. And those who got divorced maybe reconsidered, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. The divorce is really easy. A ramification of that is a whole lot of children growing up without both of their parents.
Mm,
And more often than not, it's growing up without their father,
sure.
or growing up now with mom's boyfriend or or a stepdad. And statistics on abuse show that a lot more children are abused by mom's boyfriend or stepdad than their own biological fathers. That just kind of stands to reason.
Mm-hmm.
So divorce is one. It used to be, and I don't really like the term, but it used to be when a child was born out of wedlock, it was called illegitimate. And no human life is illegitimate, but children born out of wedlock have so many disadvantages too. Disadvantages like not having a parent, not having a stable home. And I think the latest statistic tells us something like 40% of children born in America now are born to parents who are not married to one another. That doesn't mean they're always bad parents, and it doesn't mean they're definitely going to have an unstable home. But mom and dad married to one another by and large tends to be more stable for the children. So ramifications of that show up in statistics like crime, gang activity, and just poor performance in school, insecurity for young people. I mean, a lot of people are talking about mental health now, and anxiety and depression and fear. And obviously those are all real things. They're all complicated. But statistics also tell us when children have a stable home with their mother and father married to one another and they live together and they do life together, they have a better chance at growing into responsible adulthood. That has ramifications for all of society. So I said divorce, and easy divorce. Yeah, I went off on divorce, and
And just, you also said about children who are born to parents who are not
you
married.
are not married. That's right.
Right.
And that was the other one. There's one other one, and I'm trying to remember what Dr. Morse went, divorce, and I can't remember what it is. So sorry, maybe I went off on a tangent there a little bit, but some ramifications. I mean, I'm just talking about ramifications for societal health overall,
Right.
raising the next generation. The best context to raise the next generation is mom and dad married and raising their biological children the best that they can. And that's hard to do. And obviously that is not a panacea because there are problems in nuclear families too. But by
Right.
and large, children do better with their parents than they
Right.
do just with one parent or their grandparent
Yeah.
or just being thrown into the school system or the social services system.
I think too, a lot of women, and I think about it from the perspective of a woman. And if you think on one hand, I'm my own woman, I can be with whomever I want. I'm not in this committed relationship. My son was telling me last night that he saw a video or something of this woman who's going to get married, and her dad was saying, I will pay for the wedding. But then she told her dad, well, I'm an independent woman and I don't want my new husband, I don't want to take his last name because that shows I'm property. And dad, I don't want you to walk me down the aisle because I'm not your property. And he said, well, I'm not going to pay for your wedding then. If you're an independent woman, then pay for your own wedding. And she didn't like it. She was upset. I think she was the one who recorded the video. And my
Interesting.
my son was like, you can't have it both ways. And that's what I think about a lot of things.
Yeah.
If you're going to say I'm this young independent woman, I can be with whatever man I want. We had TV shows, and I used to watch it when it first came out, The Bachelor, where you had this one guy with about 30 other women trying to get his attention, and at the end he was going to propose to one of these ladies. Well, they would when they got into like the top three, they get to stay in a room with him. He takes them on this date. And I was like, he's not paying for it. The show is. So they'd act like they're so impressed, these women. I'm like, it's the show who's paying for this extravagant gift. But at the end, they'd be like, if you want to stay the night with me, you can, but it's up to you. And they'd show the door close, and you can imagine what's going on behind closed doors. But it's like, ladies, you want the man to respect you, to value you, to cherish you, but you're willing to give him your body, and it cheapens sex overall because it makes it cheap when you're just willing to go sleep with these men. And I feel like the sexual revolution, like, we don't realize, even as women, the mentality, and I say we as a whole, women don't realize that you've not only cheapened sex, but you cheapen your value when you're in a non-committed relationship with men and thinking that you're an independent woman. You can't have it both ways. You have to decide, am I valuable? And I think, some of it, the mentality is off, because I don't look at my dad walking me down the aisle. It was not my dad's property. He never treated me as property. And I was happy to take my husband's last name because I love him. And I wanted to be attached to him. And that itself, taking the name of the spouse, has a historical value and historical meaning and things, a lot more than we try to downplay it today. And so I feel like even those are, like you said, when you look at the ramifications of the sexual revolution, how they affect culture, you also have to look at it and say, but look at how men and women, the relationship between men and women it's not better today. It's far more worse. And the woman is not more valued. I would say she's undervalued because of it in some ways, to some men, not all men.
Right. And I would totally agree with pretty much everything you just said there. And you had asked about feminism, so that does kind of touch on feminism as well. And as my understand it, the original feminists, sometimes people will talk about first wave, second wave, and third wave feminism.
Yes.
And the first wave feminist was mostly the ones who wanted to vote, but they also advocated for a living wage for their husbands so that they could have a good income and raise their family. It was not so that they could go out and do their own thing. And then second wave feminism came along, and that was more like throwing off the confines of being at home so that they could go out in the workplace and work like men and to kind of turn it around. I mean, I did the corporate workplace thing until I had kids. And I was like, I really want to be with my kids. And what that meant was the husband is then he's the one going out into the workplace. That's hard.
Yeah.
Raising the kids is hard too. But I
Right.
wanted to be home with the kids.
Hmm.
And so, I think those who say that you're like the slave of your husband because you're home, maybe sometimes have it backwards because the husband's the one who's having to go out and deal with the workplace and doesn't really have a choice because he's the only one bringing in an income or he's bringing in the big income. Um, and I guess I would also say those who feel like they're property by taking on someone else's name don't have a healthy sense of their own self-esteem to begin with. If you think the name designates that you belong to someone else, I mean, in the biblical picture, we all belong to God, right? Or those of us who have choose to can
Right.
come under the authority of God and we belong to him. And then when a husband and wife get married in the traditional kind of a ceremony, they're coming together and placing both of themselves under the authority of God or under the authority of Christ. And everyone's under authority or everyone's under some kind of boundary. If we throw all of those off, then we're all really just we're all just like free agents out there fending for ourselves.
Hmm.
That doesn't make for any kind of healthy community. That doesn't satisfy our relational needs. And what sometimes end up happening is people are kind of out there in the world fending for themselves because they don't want to tie themselves to anyone else, but they're lonely and they're looking for connection. So they try to get it by having sex.
Hmm.
I mean, sex will give you the feelings of some connection, but if you're really not bonded by having made a commitment, then it's really just a feeling of connection. And maybe it's going to hurt a whole lot more when you find out it was only a feeling of connection, but not a real commitment.
Right.
So
Right.
that's another ramification, I think, of
Sure.
women, especially. I mean, I guess men do it too. I've never been a man. I haven't raised sons. You have.
Mhm.
So I can only kind of speak from the woman's perspective, but to give yourself away sexually and then find out that that person, is really not there for you, that hurts.
Oh, sure. Sure. I read Nancy Pearcey's Love Thy Body, which I love Nancy Pearcey. I think she is a phenomenal Christian apologist. And what I love that she does, she can take the Bible and take apologetics and infuse it. And that is really my heart with discipleship. I love to do that for obviously the believer, and hopefully with the unbeliever, you'll get to the Word of God eventually. But one of the things I did, I was reading it with a friend, and who is promiscuous, and while we were going through Love Thy Body, she was making the case for this two-story like dichotomy where people separate basically this upper story, lower story, and the mind and the body. Like I can do what I want with my body. It's a lesser thing as long as in my mind I'm okay and I think this is my body. I can do what I want with it. That's
Mhm.
how people will identify. No, this is my body. It may be biologically female, but I tell my body that it will be male, or that's the transgender side of it. But when having sex outside of marriage and having multiple partners, she said younger people especially, or people who are promiscuous, will say it's okay because this is my body, but it doesn't really mean anything because I won't let it affect me. She said that just isn't true, and it has so many more unhealthy results when you're going out there and being promiscuous. And the friend that I was with said, yes, that is true, because he said, I've hooked up with people before and thinking that it's nothing. And then the next day, if I see this Instagram post where this person I was with is out on a date or whatever, I'm kind of like, wait, but we were just together the other night.
Mhm.
And you try to tell yourself that you're going to get away from that because it's just sex, it's just the body. But the soul and the mind will not allow you to, because God has made you one being with all of those things. We cannot compartmentalize the
Right. It just
distinct.
doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And so it is really a lie of this. And I think the culture itself makes it look appealing because you have reels and you have these little cutesy snippets of people pretending like they're living this best life, going wherever they want with whoever they want to go with. But in reality, according to Nancy Pearcey and her, studies and things, and also from what I've seen, it's just, you cannot do it. You cannot live that way because it is a lie. It is a facade because we are made for, like you said, community. We are made for relationship. That is how God hardwired us. And we want that kind of love. We want love within a committed relationship. We want to have someone say, you are mine for all of life, and I will commit myself to you, and we will be exclusive to each other. How beautiful is that God has
Yeah, and
designed
it
it that
works
way?
better for everyone involved.
Yes.
Sometimes it's hard. I mean,
It,
commitment means you've got to take a risk.
sure.
Love is taking a risk. I mean, love is always taking a risk because we get hurt. But yeah, it works out in the long run better for everyone,
Yes.
including the next generation. And you mentioned earlier about how it cheapen the body and the person is cheapened when we just have random sex,
Mhm.
hookup culture. It just cheapens the body, it cheapens the person. But it also, if you're going to cheapen the act that produces children, you end up cheapening the children too.
Yeah.
And that's why we have so much more coarseness in the discussion now around abortion. We've had massive abortion for 50 some years now, or is it 60? It's 1970, no, 50 years now. And even just the discussions about it have gotten so much more coarse,
Hmm.
as if it is not a human being that we're talking about,
Sure.
but it is.
Yes. And not only that, there used to be language that was if it's necessary, if the mother's life is in jeopardy, if it's under rape or incest, and now it's, what trimester would you like to have your abortion in?
All right, shout
And
your abortion.
shout your abortion.
Yeah.
A mother with a pregnant belly saying not a human. And
Yeah.
it's like you feel that baby moving. That baby is moving in your belly. I know it because I was pregnant, and I could feel when my baby had hiccups
Yeah.
and all of those things. And it's like I saw ultrasounds where they're sucking their thumb at 18 weeks and she was further along than that. And you can say with another little baby standing next to you, a little toddler, not a human. And so yes, this is all from way back in the sexual revolution, but I want people to understand that it goes further back than that. And I also heard, politics is downstream from culture, and these things become law and they become policies, but they're no less moral issues. They're no less uh, truth versus false, what's true and what's versus. We have to look at it that way, not just, oh, it's a political thing, we shouldn't be getting into it, because that's another thing Christians will say today, which is a whole other topic for a whole other day. But yeah, when we look at this, thinking about the sexual revolution in history, but look at where we are now and how far we've come so fast.
Yeah. And we
And
haven't even talked about the alternative sexual lifestyles. But that was really an outcome of the sexual revolution too. If the starting point for Western civilization was sex is a male female thing meant for one of each in a lifetime bonded relationship, and then you take out the requirement that it's a lifetime bonded relationship. Next, it was taken out the requirement that it was one male and one female was taken
yes,
out. And then we started fracturing, I say we, collective society, finding people fracturing us into these identity group categories that are multiplying into greater and greater categories. And those things are being pitted against one another, most in the political realm. That is another just ramification of the sexual revolution. If sex is just something that we do with our bodies, do it any way you please. And activists and cultural revolutionaries will want to pit people one against the other. And we see the sexual identity groups pitting groups one against the other.
right.
And it's ugly.
Yeah.
It's
That's what
ugly, and there's a lot of anger.
I was thinking the same thing, that if we talk about, if even if you say God made sex between for the bounds of marriage, you have to define marriage now because it's been redefined. So we have to even go back to that. But also, we are at the brink of you know, even sex with minors, we talk often about, I hear the words consensual, consensual. Well, there's a reason that keeps coming up.
Mhm.
And the terminology changing from pedophiles and pedophilia to minor attracted persons.
Yeah.
The thing is,
Intergenerational love is another word that they use.
yes. And it's like, we have to look at these ideas because I'm reading this worldview book right now in preparation for a project. And I really love the kind of the analogy that the author brings forth. And he said, you know, bad ideas are like viruses. You catch them when you're around people. And a lot of times people don't even realize where they get the bad idea. Because you might be like, why do you believe such and such? I don't know. I just do. Well, you believe it because it was implanted at some point. You got it from some source.
Mhm.
So we can always follow these beliefs back to a source, but then we have to forward motion that and find out, where does that end? Where is it going to lead to? And I don't know that people will take their minds and unravel it that far and say, this could be this, logically, this is where it will end. Because I don't know that we challenge ourselves. Sometimes we go with what feels good in the moment. And that is another thing that God has called us to. The fruit of the spirit is self-control, because it's not about what pleases me in the moment. It's about holding to the word and the standard that God has set forth, because what's going to be better for me in the long term. And I
Right. And
really,
better for everyone else too.
yes,
What's
yes,
better for one is better for all in the
exactly.
biblical picture. There's so much. God made a world that was meant to be orderly. And when we follow the order that was built into the world, it just works so much better. It's
Yeah,
beautiful and it's good.
it
And
is.
life flourishes and humans flourish. And then
Absolutely.
when we push against them or defy them, we only really harm ourselves. It's kind of like trying to defy the law of gravity and trying to fly. You end up not breaking the law, but you end up breaking yourself.
Right. Right. And I like what you said about no fault divorce, which I read that goes back to Ronald Reagan during his presidency, is when he instituted no fault divorce. And by that in the 80s, I was a kid. I wasn't even paying attention to politics at all because I was just too young to care. But I read Them Before Us, and with Katie Faust.
Yeah.
Great. She backs up everything that you're saying, because she has done so much research about children and how they're really the ones who are getting hit big time.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I mean, whenever revel, if it, and it's almost like a war. It's just not a hot war with bullets being shot, but whenever there is war or whenever there is revolutionary movements like this, the ones who are hurt the most are those who are the most vulnerable,
Hmm.
and that starts with the children. And I think maybe second, I want to say the women, because the
Yes.
women are the ones who get pregnant. And pregnancy, I've been pregnant 3 times. It's a very vulnerable position.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful thing. I mean,
Mhm.
who else can take semen and turn it into a human life? That's kind of a
Right.
big deal to be able to do that.
Right.
But it's also a very vulnerable position to be in. And war harms the most vulnerable. And I think it's the children and the women. It harms the men too, but it seems to almost go in that order. And how sad is it as a culture that we're harming the children in the next generation? I mean, this it's almost like
Absolutely.
cultural suicide.
Absolutely. I think about that with my own husband and how he takes care of the family, and it's a partnership. We have different roles, and I love the one that I get to be, and the part that I get to play in this family. But you're right. When you bring in a child whose parents are not married, or when you have a family that's divorced and broken, that suddenly makes that child more vulnerable, because he does not have the protection of that mother-father relationship. And what Katie Faust said was, and I love this because I remember feeling this way about my own parents, because my parents are very affectionate, probably too affectionate, where I'm like, okay, like, you're in your
Mhm.
60s, chill out. But she said a child feels the most loved. Like, um, a lot of kids feel love when you spend time with them. A lot of kids feel love when you take care of them. But she said the only other gesture where a child feels direct love is when their mother and father are loving each other. When their mother and father go and kiss each other or give each other a hug or show that affection, the child feels loved themselves because they know that they're in a home where they feel safe, and mom and dad, there's no threat to their world being disrupted or broken. And when I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, that is so sweet. And I also remember feeling that when my parents were as affectionate as they were growing up. And there are times when I even mess with my own boys when they see me and their dad hug or kiss or something. I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys, because they're teenagers. And, but I said, hey, you should be thankful and happy that your parents love each other
Yeah.
and that you get to see the love that we do have for one another. So it is very interesting that we can make our children so much more vulnerable in these broken relationships when the parents either divorce or they're brought into a broken home automatically or born into it.
Yeah.
And then the women, like you said, are second, because I know how I feel with my own children and how I felt as a young mother. If you feel like your children are at risk of something, you feel at risk. I don't know if there's any other relationship where a person can feel the pain of another person, as when a mother feels her child's hurt, or rejoice when the children are rejoicing. I always tell my boys, oh, when you hurt, it hurts my heart. So
Mhm.
it's a beautiful relationship, but it
Yeah.
can be vulnerable if under the wrong circumstances.
Yeah.
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 Very interesting. So I mentioned, I guess, expressive individualism. How does
Mhm.
this notion of expressive individualism relate to the sexual revolution?
Yeah, it seems to be, and I am no expert on this, but it seems to be it's just when people are so driven to identify themselves with their sexual preferences and make that their identity. And also, it seems to me it's almost, and I'm speculating here just based on what I've seen, but even with abortions, it's like women want to make us, in some cases, not all, but want to make the statement that they are independent women, and an abortion, it sometimes becomes a way of making that statement, it seems, saying
Mhm.
I'm nobody's slave, I'm not going to follow anybody's rules. And that also, maybe in the alternative sexualities, I mean, I want to say it was back in the 80s or the 90s where the one of the phrases of the gay movement was, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. And sometimes you'll still see that, and it's almost like, I am who I am,
Mhm.
and you need to you just need to accept it. And I am who I am is really an affront to the Lord who said, I am who I am.
Mhm.
There's either God is going to be the center of one's life, or the self is going to be the center of one's life. And all this sexual identity categorization and I am who I am, get used to it, is just an affront to God, I think. And
Oh, yeah.
there was oh my goodness, it's somewhere in Isaiah, and I want to say, I can't quote it exactly, but the prophet is speaking, and I want to say he's speaking to Babylon, and he says something like, you deceive yourself when you say I am, and there is none but me. Your wisdom and your knowledge. I can't. Oh shoot. I don't have it in front of me, and I'm not quoting it
I'm gonna
well.
try to look it up right now. Yeah.
Yeah,
I,
your
I
wisdom and your knowledge deceive you when you say, "I am, and there is none but me." But this idea of expressive,
mm.
what is it? Expressive individualism is kind of like saying to God, "I am,
Yes, it is. It's
none but
Isaiah
me."
47:10. You have trusted in your wickedness and have said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and knowledge mislead you when you say to yourself, I am, and there is none beside me.
Yeah, that's expressive individualism, isn't it?
Ooh, that is good. I have never thought. See, I love that apologetic that you just brought up. We're talking about, like I said, expressive individualism, and then you brought in the example of the homosexual. We're here, we're queer, get over it, get used to it. And God saying, I am, and you're challenging that and saying, no, I will use those same words about myself. And we know that I am is Yahweh, is the, even when you think about the Hebrew people who wouldn't even, who were even afraid to say the very word, the very name of God back then for fear of, blaspheming his name or whatever, the scribes who would write it and break the pen and get it something new to write his name, the reverence that they had. And then it's blowing me away that you're tying that into expressive individualism. I totally see that.
Well, it's like our culture is just giving God the finger.
Yeah.
And un that's abhorrent and it's unfortunate and there's really bad consequences for it. And
Yes.
it makes it harder to be a Christian parent or to openly profess to be a Christian. But that's what we're called to do.
Hmm.
And there's good reason there's good reason to live that way. And that's why
Yes.
I like apologetics. I think that's maybe why you like apologetics too.
I do, but I love how you brought the Bible in and tied that together. I think that that's something rare that I see in apologetics. I don't see it as much, I guess you would say, in apologetics, because I think a lot of people are using apologetics to defend the faith with non-believers, so they know that the biblical source isn't going to, be something that persuades others right off the bat. And like I said, it's a goal to get there. But I love how you do it because Christians need apologetics too. And when
Well, yeah.
Christians, I feel like Christians need it almost or just as much as the secular
Yeah.
world. I
Well, it's the
really,
source for our worldview. And I
yeah,
mean, if we say it's the best explanation of reality, yeah, I mean, it,
yeah.
expressive individualism is really not new. It's,
No, it's
yeah.
not. It's just a different term. It may be called, identified under a different, title or name, but it's like you said, it's not new. Solomon said it best. There's nothing new under the sun. And human nature is something that when, like you said, if God is not sitting on the throne of our hearts, we will remove him and we're going to put ourselves there, our own desires and the things that we want. And
And then we're going to become a train wreck.
exactly. We will become a train wreck. And I just also want the listeners to remember that we now live in a post-Christian America. We are moving further away from that. And I think the election, the way the media talks, their conversations and the way that they report things, when you hear the way that they talk about Christians, just watch. I mean, it's really setting the pace for how the culture is going to become more hostile towards Christianity. But these things don't just happen overnight. These ideas don't just, oh, by the way, here's the sexual revolution, boom, and it happens. Like you said, there was this progression leading up to it. And what I want to talk about now is how has the sexual revolution impacted the church? And again, I hear a lot of negative talk. I actually had a writer reach out to me a few years ago and ask me if I was part of the purity culture and asked me some questions. And she's like, but the Bible's not very clear though on sex and how and I was like, are you a Christian? Have you opened your Bible? Like, I didn't even know what her background was. I probably should have asked her, but you could tell she wanted to write a negative piece on the purity culture and how I was affected by it in living my life. And so there's disdain that comes with encouraging women to be modest. And I don't even know that people encourage modesty as much. I did hear a lot about it growing up because that was the kind of era. But what have you seen in regards to this impact on the church?
Yeah, I'm a little bit older than you, so purity culture was not a thing that when I was growing up. But I think you did a really smart thing to just put the question back to this person you're mentioning, and like, what do you mean by that?
Hmm.
To use a Greg Koukl question,
Yeah.
um, because purity culture, I remember seeing it coming from a distance, and the idea was you have your sexuality and you want to keep it and save it for the one who's going to commit himself to you,
Hmm.
or vice versa, depending on who you're talking to, a son or a daughter. But then I have heard stories that said that was kind of perverted. Like what I just said, I think is a reasonable and healthy approach to take. And if you want to call it purity, that's okay. But what I have heard that it has been misused such that let's say a 14 or a 15-year-old has already been somewhat sexually active, well, if she's told she can never be pure again, well, that's kind of contradicts the gospel, because
Sure.
God can make us new creatures, and God can heal us and make us new and forgive us and all that. And we can become new. And then I've also heard stories where maybe the ideal was put on the female, that, well, men can't control their sexuality, so you got to be the one who's in charge of keeping him sexually pure. And I think that's pretty false too. That's not biblical,
Right.
because men are called to have self-control, just like women are.
Right.
And so it really kind of depends on what is meant by quote unquote
Mhm.
purity culture.
Right.
And you said something earlier about the political year that we're coming up on and the hostility out there. And it is true that those who are hostile to Christianity are going to want to an attempt to define the terms of the discussion. And what's incumbent on us is to not play into the discussion according to their terms,
Mhm.
but to define the terms that we use, find out what they're saying and what their charge is. And if they're making an accusation like, well, no one should tell a 14-year-old that she'll never be pure because she's been sexually active. Well, we kind of maybe agree with that.
Sure.
So, um, as for how, I mean, that's my response to purity culture. It really depends on what is being meant by purity culture.
Right. And I think a lot of people in church will be like, oh, well, we can't talk about purity and modesty anymore because it makes people, one, dislike the church, and two, it makes people feel bad. And there is an opportunity for the gospel within, I believe, every message, but especially one when you talk about purity culture. And maybe we don't even want to, that's what it was when I was growing up. I don't know that I would call it purity culture today. I
Right.
just think, I think talk to the young kids about marriage, about sex. And
Yeah.
that's another thing, is that parents um haven't always been the most comfortable talking to their kids about these topics.
Yeah,
And
nor
I,
has the church. I mean,
yeah, nor has the
and
church.
it's all out in the culture. And I mean, you did ask how the sexual revolution is affecting the church. And one thing that comes to my mind is you see churches splitting along these sexual lines. Are they gay affirming or not? And I mean,
Yeah.
there's another example of how we need to define the terms. We affirm the worth and dignity. Well, a healthy, well-balanced church is going to affirm the health and dignity of everybody made in the image of God, because they're made in the image of God, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean we affirm all sexual behaviors.
Mhm.
And we have a source um, for our boundaries around sexual behaviors. And I mean, it's a whole discussion that just cannot be reduced to soundbite yes or no answers to soundbite questions.
Yes, exactly. And I think that there are some people who, if they try to trap you into a yes or no answer, yes or no question, and on these topics, then it likely is a trap, because there is a lot more context that needs to go with it, like you said. But the very first thing we have to do is define what is meant by purity culture. We have, I forget the name, but he wrote Why I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Well,
Josh Harris.
yes, he was
Mhm.
huge when I was, growing up, and everybody loved his book. Well, he's deconstructed from the faith, and now he's like, never mind, guys. I regret writing that. Did you know that, or no, that he deconstructed?
Yeah, you blipped for a minute. Yeah, he's divorced now, right? I think
Yes.
he divorced and he came out, and I want to say maybe he's even renounced his Christianity now.
Yes. Yes.
Well,
He did.
okay. I mean,
Right.
I mean, we have free will, and we can do that. It says something about him. It doesn't necessarily say there's anything wrong with the biblical prescription for sex within marriage.
Sure. Exactly. Exactly. But I do, yeah, I think the church, what I find to be maybe a little bit of a snare for the church is that God's word never changes. Like cross culturally, he holds true to his word. God never changes. But the
Mhm.
culture is constantly changing, reinventing the wheel, coming up with new terms. And
Mhm.
sometimes I think the church can feel like, well, we're being left behind. We look too old fashioned. But that in itself is a fallacy in logic. Just because something is quote unquote considered old fashioned does not mean it's not true. And so we have to remember as the church, hold fast to the standard that God has set, whether it be about sex, marriage, raising children, the family, whatever it is, whatever topics we're discussing, and will be the beacon of light in a culture that's constantly changing. But when the culture tries to go out and experiment with these things and say, it's okay, it's my body, I can do what I want because it's not going to affect me, I can detach from that, and they find out that that is not true, that's not reality, they're going to look for a healing balm. They're going to look for the truth. They're going to need someone to tell them,
Yeah.
let me tell you what the word of God has to say and
Yeah.
how it can help you pick up the pieces to that. And that's when an unchanging word will anchor them, and God, like you said, his love never fails and his grace reaches far and wide. And I think that that's just a very encouraging thing that we can be ready to speak into.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also offers an explanation for why all that pain happens.
Yes.
It makes sense of things, and the world feels so senseless sometimes.
Yes.
And the biblical picture of reality really just makes sense of all those things that seem so senseless without it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Terrell, I am excited to have had you on the show today. I love talking about this, but can you tell us a little bit about Salvo and how people can connect with you, connect with Salvo?
Well, sure. Yeah, Salvo, we're online. It's also a print quarterly, like you mentioned earlier. Salvo has been in publication since 2006, and it actually was launched out of an effort to take up the science versus religion debate. That was the era of the new atheists, but it was decided from the beginning not just to talk about science, but also to talk about sexuality and society in general, because there is design in the universe that can be detected scientifically, but there's also design to the way we're made that for our sexuality and for how a society ought to be rightly ordered so that it functions in a healthy way for everybody who lives in it. So that's how Salvo became a magazine of science, sex, and society. And it's online, salvomag.com. The target reader is like college age. And while we write from a biblical perspective, you won't find things like devotions or Christian living in there so much. You'll find articles that really the goal is to make sense of the confusion in the culture and just try to point to the biblical worldview as the best way to make sense of it all and align ourselves and our lives and our thinking with the way that the world is made so that life works better for everybody.
Yes, absolutely. It is a great magazine, and you guys are in step with what is going on in the culture and what people are talking about today. It's very much a very current and with it,
Well,
for
good.
lack
Well,
of a
thank
better
you.
word,
That's what we try to
magazine.
be.
Oh,
Yeah,
for
we talked
sure.
to one time about like listing the things that, well, we were kind of talking about this before it was on the mainstream news, like transgenderism and things like that. But thank you. It's nice to hear that. That's what we try to do.
Yes, absolutely. Well, for you guys that are listening, I will make sure that I link the information to Salvo and in the show notes, and you can get a hold of Terrell, you can get a hold of any of the writers there. Not that you would need to, but you can definitely look them up and subscribe to that magazine. It's just another resource in your library that you can pull from and learn from. And I think it's because I teach middle schoolers and have kids of my own. It's great to sit down and read it with them, go over it with them, use it as a learning tool, a discussion topic at the dinner table. You won't regret it. And I actually shared about the Barbie movie. It was one of your writers, Terrell, a few
Hmm.
months ago, who did a critique of the movie, and it made me go watch the movie because I thought, I'm not going to watch it, I'm just going to share all this stuff. And I thought, well, that's not fair either because I haven't assessed it myself. I wanted to see, and I thought that that was such a great article. So
Yeah.
lots of great things over there. So if you guys have any questions for me, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com. Again, I encourage you to get in touch with getting linked up with Salvo Magazine, and I'll catch you on the next one.